Hello, welcome to our third Iowa Archaeology Month live stream talk. I am Elizabeth Reitz with the University of Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist, and today I'm excited for this presentation. We have Cherie Haury-Artz, who has been doing some really incredible faunal analysis work at Site PM7 in Plymouth County, far western Iowa. She's going to let you know all about it. And as always, this program is a live lecture, but feel free to add a question to the comments in Facebook or YouTube at any time. I'll be monitoring the questions, and then I'm going to pop back in at the end of Cherie's presentation to help moderate those questions. But right now, I'm going to let her get to it. So I'll just add her presentation here and take it away, Cherie.
Okay, and I'm just going to jump right ahead and go on into the presentation. So what we're going to be talking about today is a very specific topic about the use of bison at this archaeological site. But I want to start out, first of all, with the University of Iowa's land acknowledgement. I personally am really aware that my entire career is based on the study of other people's story, of the indigenous peoples of the plains that I've been studying for my whole career. This land acknowledgement recognizes the fact that the University of Iowa is on the land of homelands of all of the tribes you see listed here. The Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, the Bahoji, the Kickapoo, Menominee, Miami, Missouri, Omaha, Osage, Oto, Ottawa, Ponca, Potawatomi, the Meskwaki, and the Sauk, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, the three affiliated tribes, and the Ho-Chunk. And we want to recognize the fact that we acknowledge that the land that these people have. We're going to talk today about the Joy Creek Major Site, or 13 PM7, which is located up here in Plymouth County in far western Iowa. It's a late prehistoric period site associated with the Mill Creek Culture Village. It's situated along the Big Sioux River in Plymouth County, so it's almost into the Missouri River drainage. There's a specific phase. There's two Mill Creek phases, one associated with the Little Sioux and one associated with the Big Sioux. The site dates between AD 1100 and AD 1250. So in June, if you all think back a few years, June was a rainy year. This year's been a drought year, but in 2019, the rivers in western Missouri, or in western Iowa, the Missouri River flooded 3 times and inundated this site. And it was seriously damaged by the levee break. And now, there we go. The flooding washed the surface of the site. It exposed a large number of artifacts and features. It was a unique thing. In fact, there were some things that were definitely washed and scattered by the force of the water flowing over it. But many of the features appear to have just been collapsed, with the dirt washed out from in between the artifacts so that the whole thing concentrated down into a pile. And I want to take a minute to recognize all of the people who were involved in this project. It's a really great example of people, the landowner, the tenant who was working the land, recognizing that something was going on here, notifying people. The word got back to the State Archaeologist's office. And allowed us to collect a lot of information on this site, despite the fact that it had been badly damaged by these levee breaks and the flooding. The landowner and the tenant were very cooperative. We had a large volunteer crew who went out and worked in the cold weather, from the people from the IAS, both professionals and avocationalists, and a lot of people, good site stewards, cooperating together, allowed for a project that's going to come up with a lot of valuable information. So this is what some of the features looked like when they were exposed on the surface. And as you can see here, we've got articulated vertebra from a large animal here. And this is the sort of thing that started capturing my attention. I'm doing the analysis of just the mammal bones. So other people are working on the fish bones and the bird bones. So there's going to be a lot of fascinating information about the animals. But for this case, we're just working on the mammal bones today. Ken and John Kavami of the University of Arkansas volunteered their services to do a gradiometry survey of the site. And you can see showing up here in the black lines that there is still evidence that this site was fortified. There are bastions and everything showing up very clearly in the gradiometry survey. And all the little yellow dots are features that the archaeologists examined as exposed on the surface. And here's a drone shot, and you can see the scatter of the features that were examined. And in just a matter of a few days of research, they came up with more than 15,000 mammal bones. A preliminary analysis tells us that we have bison, elk, deer, canids, both domestic and wild, beaver, and a whole selection of small mammals such as raccoons, squirrels, and rabbits. There's a category over here, this bison slash elk. These are bones that were so heavily fragmented that they can't be identified specifically, but they're clearly from a large animal, and the two large animals that are represented at this site are bison and elk. So NISP here means that's the number of individual specimens, and we can use that to calculate the number of animals represented. And today we're going to focus in on bison. So we had a very large number, more than 300 bison elements identified, nearly 2,000 elements that were either bison or elk. And because elk are represented, but minimally represented, most of these are probably also bison. But we want to zoom in on the bison today. We have at least 5, whoops, I'm going to go back a second. The minimum number, if you calculate minimum number based on the most abundant element, we have shoulder blades. And it shows us that there are at least 11 bison represented. But I think this might be an inflation because almost all of the shoulder blades were tools. They were scapula hoes or knives and things like that. And these tools could probably be curated. They might be carried from one village to the next. They might be held onto for a number of years till they completely wear out and get thrown away. If you use anything but the scapula, the most frequent bones tell us that there is at least 5 animals, bison represented. So feature 86 was the one that first grabbed my attention. And if we look closely at this feature, we see bone, we see fire-cracked rock, we see pottery, shell, groundstone tools. There's a lot of material concentrated here. But look at this, bones here. We have an articulated spine of a large mammal, and we get it out of the ground. And here are the common animals represented and the numbers. This is the minimum numbers of species. And we're going to take a look at bison. These animals are certainly the mall of the Americas. They had many, many, many uses. But a bull bison weighs up more than 2,000 pounds, and a cow at least 1,400 pounds. So once you've killed one of these, you have a lot of work in order to get any use out of this animal. What we found here in feature 86 was 19 articulated bison vertebra. It represents everything from just behind the skull. We have the atlas and axis vertebra that rotate the head, all of the neck vertebra, and all of the thoracic vertebra. And these are the ones that have the ribs attached to them. This is kind of unusual to find in a village site. These are all large bones. I just wanted to add these slides to show you these are what the cervical vertebra, the neck vertebra look like. And these are what the thoracic vertebra look like. And key to our story here, besides the fact that bison weigh so much, thousands of pounds, are these very long spines on the back of the thoracic vertebra. This is what creates the hump on the back of a bison. And it also adds difficulties when it comes to trying to butcher a bison. Again, you can see how long the spinous process is. You can also see here are the little pits where the ribs attach. But this is a small one, and it's 40 centimeters, the length of the spine. We also find associated with these backbones, we find the proximal ends of the ribs. This is the end of the ribs that attach right to those little processes along the back of the thoracic vertebra. Feature 86, it turned out, was not unique. I was excited to see one articulated spine, but here's feature 23, another articulated spine and associated ribs you can see. And in feature 34, it's showing up again. There's the big atlas and axis vertebra and all of the neck vertebra. This is curiouser and curiouser. So I turned to the literature, the material that's read, and I turned to George Frisen's work on the prehistoric hunters of the high plains. Frisen was an archaeologist, a rancher, and a hunter. And in this book, he accumulated the data from many, many bison kill sites on the Western Plains. And he processed all of this this information using the interpretation of marks on the bones, the composition of different kinds of anatomical units that were found at the kill site, the kinds of tools that were associated with them. And then he turned to historic accounts of Native Americans hunting and butchering bison. And then because he's a rancher and one of the things he raised was bison, he did his own experimentation as well to see how these interpretations worked out. And so this picture here is George Frisen butchering a bison. So every prehistoric hunter, every time you make a kill, you have decisions that you have to make. Every single kill is unique, but one thing we wanted to look at as archaeologists is to try and see what kinds of patterns. We want to understand the decisions that people were making. You have to work fast to prevent the spoilage of the meat and to get the maximum use of the animals. But sometimes the decisions are tricky. There's light butchering, which is when you have either one or more very large animals. Maybe there aren't very many people with you. Maybe you just have a small hunting party and suddenly you have 2 dead bison. Or if you're a long way from home and you have to carry all this meat a long way, you're going to strip the kill down. You're going to leave non-useful parts behind. You might eliminate the skull. You might eliminate the feet. You might take the meat off of the main part of the carcass and throw away the vertebra, just so you could have maximum amount of return and not a lot to carry home. Butchering is easy. If you have a small animal, a rabbit, you throw him in the bag, you take him home. A bison, it's not going to work that way. Heavy butchering means that you can transport whole portions of a carcass back to your village or your camp. You might quarter it. You take a back leg, you take a front leg, I'll take the ribs, but you can pretty much bring home the whole animal. You could also do this when you have a deer and you can just gut it and strap it on a pole and 2 people can bring it home. Again, that's not going to work with 2,000 pounds of bison. And then you have a systematic butchering process, which is what's pictured here in this lovely painting from the State Historical Society of North Dakota. This is when you've done something like driven 190 giant longhorn bison into an arroyo, like they did at the Olson-Chubbuck site. This, you've got a lot of meat, and you've got to process it rapidly to keep it from spoiling. Usually in cases like this, in the historic accounts, whole villages would go out on these big hunts. They would have drives or drive things into arroyos or into corrals and kill a large number of bison at once. And then you set up a systematic kill processing system. So it's like an assembly line of people working all the way through it. Even at some places like at the Olson-Chubbuck site, the bison on the bottom of that arroyo were not processed. It probably took too long to process as many as they did, and the meat was starting to spoil, and it was time to move on. So each situation is unique, but by looking at the different kinds of butchering of anatomical units we find, we can make some conclusions about the decisions being made at these sites. The way you had to preserve meat when you didn't have refrigeration or ways to pickle things or salt to dry things with was to make jerky. Meat was cut into very thin, long, thin strips and hung up in the hot sun. Usually this pretty quickly, a thin film forms in a matter of minutes over the surface of the bone or the meat. And this keeps flies from laying eggs on it and allows the meat to dry slowly. The moisture comes out of it, so that reduces the bulk of the meat, making it easier to pack up and carry. Now, because of the high hump on its back, you can't roll a bison over on its back and butcher it. A deer, you can sometimes people hang it from a tree. If you're out on the high plains, you don't have a tree. And if you have 2,000 pounds of buffalo, nobody's heisting that up on a tree. So Friesen suggests the most efficient way to process a carcass of a bison is to lie it on its side and to process it one side at a time. So in this picture here, you see the men they've sliced it down the middle, they're peeling the hide back, and then as they butcher one side of the animal, they can put the useful meat onto the hide to keep it clean. You had to remove the organs and then prop it open so that it could cool properly and keep the meat from spoiling. Evidence suggests that the first thing you went for were the preferred cuts of meat, such as the brisket down here on the front shoulder. And the way you got that was to cut right along here where these red lines are, breaking the ribs off at the very distal end. And then you could chop off the ribs. The next thing you want to take is the rib meat here on one side. And again, you break the ribs right along the top. So this is going to start to look familiar, like some of the things we see from PM7. So now you have one whole side of bison barbecue ribs. You've got some brisket. And this is exactly what we found. Here we have the thoracic vertebra, and here we have those proximal ribs still associated with it. All of these are broken with spiral fractures, showing that large force was used to snap these ribs intentionally as part of the butchering process. The next thing you want to do is there's a lot of fat and meat in the hump of the bison as well. So the last step you're going to do is to recover the meat here. Also, turns out the spines on the thoracic vertebrae make very useful tools. It doesn't take much work to sharpen one, to make a nice sharp edge on it, or they make great handles and things like that. So the next thing you're going to do is chop the spines off of the thoracic vertebra and take this large hump section. And sure enough, here's a close-up of some of those thoracic vertebra, and you can see the spines have all been chopped off with spiral fractures, showing the use of powerful impact blows to break those apart. Now, George Friesen tells us that one of the most common units, butchering units, found at bison kill sites from either systematic butchering processes or light butchering, when you want to get rid of a lot of weight, are these articulated units. Once you've taken the ribs off and the hump off, this part isn't very useful. They're not very good for tools. They don't have marrow in them. There's not much you can do with them. So these articulated spines are dumped, usually at the kill site where the bison is being processed. But here we're finding them in pit features in a big permanent or semi-permanent Mill Creek village. So this suggests to me that these bison, they were processing whole bison at the site, meaning that they were killed very close by. This is shop local in the best sense of the term. These bison were right there at the site. Now there are two. You have to disarticulate a bison, to take apart the leg joints and the head joint. There's two ways you can do it. One is to use a knife and cut all those muscle and tendon attachments. Or this other thing is to use a heavy chopping tool and just break them apart. Now this is a cow femur standing in for a bison today. I want to point out some of the pieces of it. Here's the lesser trochanter, here's the greater trochanter, here's the fossa here. I just hold these thoughts in your mind for a second. Here's my cow acetabulum pretending to be a pelvis, pretending to be a bison. And here's the acetabulum. This is the joint where that ball and socket from the femur fits in it. How are they taking these joints apart at the PM7? This is what's left of the acetabulum of the bison here. You can see a little bit of that socket. They are smashed apart, again, with spiral fractures, impact blows. Here's the lesser trochanter of the femur that we were looking at. And here's that fossa where the muscles attach. So it seems to be that using powerful blows with chopping tools was the quick and efficient way that they were blasting apart the big joints of these bison at PM7. Another thing that we find at PM7 is tails. We have a number of articulated caudal vertebra. These are from a bison's tail. Usually, if you remove the hide from an animal, the tail goes along with the hide. So those little bones are still attached to the hide. Then as the hide is processed to turn it into clothing or tents or whatever use you want to put that leather to, eventually this will get cut off or cut out and the tail bones will be discarded. Here's just one of those caudal vertebrae, and you can see all of the cut marks on it from use of a sharp tool in the processing, probably of the hide. And looking around at some of the other artifacts from the same site and these features, it turns out we find lots and lots of hide processing tools. Here is a bison metatarsal fleshing tool with the notched edge. This is what you would be using to scrape all the goo and gunk off of the inside of an animal hide. Other processing tools, these are the ones without teeth. So this is a different kind of processing. The flesh has been removed and now you're softening and working the hide. We even have a hide grainer. This is the articulating end of a humerus, looking at the inside of the rough surface of the bone, and you can see there is actually red pigment still embedded in this bone. This is one of the last stages when it comes to processing a hide. And this looks like not only were they graining the hide to make it soft and pliable, but they were actually applying color to it as well. One of the other things that we have in the assemblage from PM7 is many, many awls. 22 awls or pieces of awls were identified in the assemblage. And this is just a sample of some of them. They're highly polished from use. Many of them are very sharp pointed. And these are the kinds of things, again, that you're going to be using for poking holes or sewing or other processing. So there was a lot of hide processing going on at PM7 as well. The one thing that's missing from PM7 are the skulls. And this is a curiosity to me too. First of all, we don't find the heavy chopping and blows. This is the atlas vertebra. This is the one that attaches to the skull. And it was not chopped apart. They were finding a different way to remove the skulls. And one of the ways that Friesen suggests is you could cut the tendons and ligaments and then with a sharp twist, separate the skull from the whole rest of the vertebral column. But my question was, where are these skulls? What's happening to them? If I look at the list of elements that I have here, I have vertebra, I have shoulders, I have front legs, I have back legs, I have tails, I have feet. I don't have any skulls. I have, from skull element, I have 2 maxillary teeth, top teeth. I have fragments, 6 fragments of mandibles, which would be the lower jaw. So everything else, but the heads are going somewhere else. Now, granted, this was kind of an unusual style of excavation here. It was a salvage excavation of a damaged site. The people were working with a very limited time schedule, and they were just working with material that had been exposed on the surface. But they collected flotation samples. And usually in my experience doing faunal analysis, when you get to the flotation samples, there's often lots of little fragments of tooth enamel, little pieces of skull. If the skulls were being broken open to obtain the brains to use for tanning or for eating, you still find those little fragments. And I'm not seeing them. I'm not even seeing just little scraps of enamel. So I'm really curious to know what was going on with the skulls. There are some possibilities. Did I skip one? Nope. One possibility is at Mill Creek sites, I don't seem to have my picture of it here, there are scoops made out of bison. A scoop where you break the skull and the concave part of the skull becomes a scoop and the horn core becomes a handle. If you start to look through the ethnographic art and literature, you start to see that bison skulls often got special uses. Here in a couple of paintings, one by Catlin and one by Carl Bodmer, you see bison skulls associated with cemeteries, human cemeteries. Here is an Assiniboine painting of a bison skull on a way marker. You see bison skulls being used in Okipa ceremonies. Here's a painting that Catlin made of a Mandan village, and we just see bison skulls sitting on top of the earth lodges. We don't know why, what that was symbolic of. And then if you look at Hidatsa information, this is from Gilbert Wilson's work with the Hidatsa. You see here is one of the shrines in their earth lodge, and there's a bison skull associated with that. So I wonder if at the PM7 site, if the skulls were being taken away and put to some other kind of specialized use. They certainly weren't being discarded in the same features where the bison butchering was going on and where the hide processing was going on. So we will leave that to our imaginations and to future research and try and figure out maybe what was happening, what was going on with the skulls. So that's my presentation, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Sorry, my mic was muted. I'm just going to pop in to help moderate the questions. And again, you can type a question at any time into the comment section of Facebook or YouTube. We do have some people saying great presentation, but we do have one question. So when you were talking about the chopping tools, would they resemble or even double as the axes used to chop wood?
They might have those great big grooved axes that you see. Some of those are really heavy and could be used just like a bashing tool, like a sledgehammer or something. You could also just use a big rock with a minimal amount of processing, knock a few flakes off of it so it had a pointy edge, or just pick up a piece of glacial till that fit in your hand right and use it for processing. Didn't have to be fancy.
Yeah, lots of expedient and lots of multi-tools. Yeah, just a comment. Some tribes use bison skulls as a part of their ceremonies. When certain items and objects are brought together, they create the ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
So you might know this. I'm sorry. I'm going to go to the question that was first. Are there any bison kill sites from eastern Iowa, and are they different from plains kill sites like we see in western Iowa or Nebraska?
There are certainly bison found in sites all over Iowa. We don't have evidence of the big kill sites where a whole number of animals were killed at once. It seems more like there was more individual hunting. There are plenty of traditional accounts telling us that tribes, the Iowa, the Meskwaki, would travel out west at a certain time of the year and do a bison hunt, gather up a lot of meat and bring it home again. So getting farther out on the plains where you would encounter the larger herds of animals and you could kill a lot more at once. And that was a case where the whole, a large portion of the village would go out. Probably the elderly people, women, pregnant women, small children would stay back, tend the gardens, but everybody else went off on a trip for several weeks to hunt and bring back bison.
Yeah, and of course in western Iowa, the big site that we've studied is the Cherokee sewer site.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any others?
Not in Iowa off the top of my head, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. It just means my brain's not working.
Okay, this is a good question to summarize what you've talked about, but how common is this find? Is this typical or no to find articulated bisons like this in the village?
It's more unusual in the village. The tail thing is not that uncommon because those tails often went off with the hides and were processed separately. But to find those discarded units, the units that were no longer useful, like those articulated vertebra, at the village site is unusual. That's usually left at the kill site, which is why I'm suggesting that they were killing them nearby, practically in their backyard, and processing the whole thing right there.
Yeah, so common types of butchering, but uncommon considering it was found in a village site.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about the seasons of occupation based on all of the mammals that you've looked at so far?
It looks to me like it's year-round or nearly year-round. We have very young animals, fetal or newborn deer, which would be spring animals. I also have deer. I have deer skulls, and they have attached antlers, which would be late season. So the unshed antlers tell me late fall, early winter processing. So it looks to me like it's year round, and we have to rely. There's lots of fish bones and also lots of birds. So I'm waiting on John Caudal to tell us a little bit about migratory birds and things like that to bring that home.
Can you remind us again, what's the approximate date of this site?
1100s to 1200.
And that would be, AD 1100 to 1200. Are there any more questions for Cherie while we've got her live streaming here? Those were definitely some great questions.
Yeah, well, I brought my show and tell. This is a bison thoracic vertebra that was gifted to us by Jonathan Buffalo from the bison that the Meskwaki raise at their settlement. But it's a great demonstration. So you can see when I'm holding it of scale of exactly how big those bison, those spines are that create the hump. The reason that you can't roll them over on their back. But you can also see how narrow they are, and they have a very sharp edge, and doesn't take a lot of sharpening to make some of these spines into a tool once you've stripped the meat off of them. So this part had a lot of use, whereas the centrum part, there's nothing very useful about that part.
We have one comment, and thank you for this one, Shayla. She's just saying, as an Iowa tribal member, when a child was in their cradle board, they would tie a piece of dried meat to a string and tie one end to their baby's toe. If the baby choked on the meat, the baby would kick, and the string pulled the meat back.
That's great. I didn't know that. I love it.
Steve DeVore is wondering, any evidence for bone grease processing?
Yes, there's lots of smashed up bone. That's why I have a very large number of faunal specimens and not a whole lot of intact articular ends. So I suspect there was a lot of bone grease processing.
What has been the most impressive bison site that you've worked on during your career?
Well, this one was fun. It's always the most recent one that you're working on. I also worked on a site called the Rustad site in North Dakota, which was some of the big Ice Age bison, and also very large, either canids or wolves. I suspect they had a wolf problem with that kill site. But that was fun too.
So no other questions right now. I see you have one more bone on the table there.
Oh, actually, I have a couple of them, but
okay.
Again, just to show people for the scale, this is the femur. This is my cow pretending it's a bison. But this is that lesser trochanter that we had in the picture, and the greater trochanter. But so this is a big, solid part of the bone, and they were breaking these apart in order to, and here's the hip bone and the acetabulum where they fit together. And these are all smashed up at the site. So it tells me that rather than meticulously cutting these apart, they just took a large chopping tool and whacked it right here, broke apart the acetabulum, broke apart the proximal end of the femur, and proceeded on with their butchering. I think it was a quick way to do it.
So it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. So we'll just wrap this up in the next couple minutes unless we get more questions. So I'll just take this opportunity to say that next week on Tuesday at noon, we have Colin Betts from Luther College, who will be talking on remote sensing and effigy mounds in Northeast Iowa. I've seen bits of that presentation before. It's very cool. Cherie also gave this presentation this past weekend at the Prairie Heritage Center in Northwest Iowa for Northwest Iowa Archaeology Day. But I'm glad that she could repeat this so it could reach more people virtually. And doesn't look like there's any more questions popping in. So I don't know if you have any last words or want to say anything.
No, there's going to be a lot more information coming out about this site. There are lots of volunteers, people working on dividing up the information and the pottery, the stone tools, the fish bones, the turtle bones, the bird bones.
Yeah, again, this project was a really great example of a private landowner finding something significant and then trusting archaeologists. They first reached out to the archaeologists at the Sanford Museum, and then it started this really great partnership that we hope to see more of. And at some point, we would love to also expand our site stewardship program to be able to do more projects like this and to be able to train avocationals and those interested in archaeology and how to record sites like this.
There are a lot of dedicated volunteers rushed out there to help salvage the material that was exposed by those floods.
Yeah, and again, a lot of those volunteers were members of the Iowa Archaeological Society, which is very reasonable to join. And you can do that at iowaarchaeologicalsociety.org. There's no second A in that archaeology there. Thank you again, Cherie. We have lots of thank yous popping in. Again, we'll see hopefully all of you next week for Colin Betts's presentation.
That's a great, fascinating presentation.
Yeah. Thank you.